Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the Little Miami River. I'd like to echo what John Edwards said on Paranormal Sideshow. He was talking about the top 10 things paranormal groups could do while sitting at home. The one I liked the most was update your websites. Some paranormal groups have 2008 as coming events. With time on your hands, you should try bringing the internet up to this great and wonderful 2020 that is being oh so entertaining. John also had the top 10 things you didn't want to do. Things like using an EMF detector in your bedroom. After all, if your bedroom is haunted, where are you going to go to sleep at night? Tonight's show was suggested by Lowell John Howard, the man who brought us The Beast from Between the Lakes and Jack Hinson, the Civil War Sniper. He's come up with some good ideas for shows in the past, and hopefully he'll keep coming up with good shows for the future. The Little Miami River is named after the Miami Indians, an Algonquin-speaking people who lived in the region during the early days of white settlement. The Miami natives originally lived in Indiana, Illinois, and southern Michigan at the time of the European colonization of North America. They moved into the Maumee Valley around the 1700s. They soon became the most powerful American Indian tribe in Ohio. The Miamis were thus related to the Delaware, the Ottawa, and the Shawnee. The Miamis allied themselves with the French until the British traders moved into the Ohio country around 1740. The French forced the British out of Ohio, and the Miamis allied themselves with the French until the British victory in the French and Indian Wars. As the French trading posts turned into British forts, many Miami natives moved to the present-day Indiana to avoid further battles with the more powerful British. During the American Revolution, the Miami, who were especially fearful of additional white settlers, moved into the Ohio country. They fought with the British against the United States. After the British lost the war, the Miami natives continued to fight the newly formed United States. General Anthony Wayne defeated the Miami and other Indians within the Ohio lands at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. The Miamis, along with other American Indians living in Ohio, were forced to surrender most of their Ohio lands with the signing of the Treaty of Greenville. In 1818, the United States forced the Miami to give up their last reservation in Ohio. Many of the displaced Ohio Miami settled in Indiana, but once more the U.S. federal government removed some of them to Kansas during the 1850s, while others were permitted to remain in Indiana. Descendants of the Ohio Miami are members of the federally recognized Miami Tribe of Oklahoma and the unrecognized Miami Nation of Indiana. Don't you just love it when the federal government has nothing but people's best interests at heart? And yet, today, some people still are willing to allow them to run their lives. Historically, the river, named after the Indians, formed the eastern boundary of the Sims Purchase and the western boundary of the Virginia Military District. The Virginia Military District was an approximately 4.2 million acre area of land in what is now the state of Ohio that was reserved by Virginia to use as payment in lieu of cash for its veterans of the American Revolutionary War. The first settlement in Virginia Military District was Macy's Station, which was founded in 1790. The village of Chillicothe was founded quite early as well. If you listen to the show on a regular basis, you'll have heard my adventures or misadventures while looking for an RV park in Chillicothe. That was one weird night. The Little Miami flows south, ending at the junction with the Ohio River. There just might be things living in the Ohio, and if there are, it isn't all that inconceivable to think they might swim up the Little Miami. And there's the phone call from the extended warranty people. I think they've got a spy sits outside and waits for me to log in to do the show, and then quick call. They'll probably call back. I tried figuring out how I could turn my phone off, but last time I did that, I couldn't get it to turn back on for about a week. Just in time for the show. Anyway, The Green-Clawed Beast is a story about a terrifying experience two friends had while swimming in the Ohio River one day. August 21st, 1955, Mrs. Darwin Johnson had a terrifying encounter with what she said was a hideous creature beneath the surface of the Ohio River near Evansville, Indiana, which is quite a ways from the Little Miami, but how far can things swim? Mrs. Johnson went for a swim with her friend, Mrs. Chris Lambell. Mrs. Johnson said she was suddenly grabbed around the knee by a large, hairy, claw-like hand. 15 feet from shore, Mrs. Johnson struggled to disengage herself and head for safety. Mrs. Lambell could only stare in horror as her distraught friend was yanked beneath the surface of the river. Mrs. Johnson somehow managed to kick her leg free, but almost instantly she was seized again. Mrs. Lambell shrieked, which echoed up and down the shoreline as she helplessly watched her friend being pulled below the river once again. After resurfacing a second time, Mrs. Johnson lunged for Mrs. Lambell's inner tube and thinks that perhaps the splash of her impact might have scared the beast away. Or maybe you just lost interest in her. Once back on shore, Mrs. Johnson was treated for multiple contusions on her leg, at which point it was discovered she had a green palm print-shaped stain. The stain could not be removed for several days. Although neither Mrs. Johnson nor Mrs. Lambell were able to get a clear, sustained look at the creature, it seemed to bear a close resemblance to the Thetis Lake Monster. The Thetis Lake Monster is a legendary creature from Victoria, British Columbia. 1972, two teenage boys said they saw a monster emerge from the Thetis Lake beach. The description of the creature that the teenagers gave matched the description of the Gill Man from the 1954 movie Creature from the Black Lagoon. If you haven't seen it, what are you waiting for? It's one of the classic monster movies. There's some speculation the monster was just a hoax, but the skeptics say that about everything. Other researchers have suggested that the green-clawed beast may be related to another aquatic Ohio area mystery beast known as the Loveland Frogmen, but there are no reports of encounters with these creatures being violent, at least none with people today. I'll get to the Frogman in just a bit. An interesting addition to this case was reported by Fortean investigator Terry Colvin. Colvin, who had interviewed the Johnsons, claimed that soon after the incident, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson were visited in their Goodtown, Indiana home by an individual who claimed to be an Air Force colonel. Apparently, this colonel took extensive notes regarding Mrs. Johnson's encounter with the green-clawed beast and admonished the couple to talk no further about the incident. This is along the same lines as the men in black who swoop in and threaten UFO witnesses to not talk about what they had seen. If you recall, the same men in black also showed up in Point Pleasant and told people not to talk about the Mothman. One really weird thing about Mrs. Johnson's bizarre encounter is it shares the exact same date, August 21st, 1955, as one of the most bizarre and violent encounters from Hopkinsville, Kentucky. That case became known as the Hopkinsville Goblin case. Mrs. Johnson herself was quoted in stories published in August 23rd issue of the Indiana Vidette Messenger and August 24th in issues of the California Independent, believing that her leg had been grabbed by one of those little green men from a spaceship. For the one or two of y'all that have never heard of it, the Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter, or the Hopkinsville Goblin case, was a close encounter of the weird kind with extraterrestrial beings in 1955 near Kelly and Hopkinsville in Christian County, Kentucky. Ufologists regard it as one of the most significant and well-documented cases in the history of UFO incidents. Mrs. Johnson equated her encounter with the creatures that attacked the Sutton family farmhouse. Although she never saw what grabbed her, she did have that handprint that stayed on her long enough to come to this conclusion. And now back to the Little Miami. About 2 miles above the fork of this river is a roadside marker for Cotty's Castle Rock. Not an actual castle, the rock is a tall spire with very limited access, making it an ideal place to defend against a far superior force. Back in the bad old days, during the wars between the white settlers and the Indians, a feather, not dot, who sought to keep them out of their lands, a man by the name of James Cotty found this huge rock to be an ideal place to fend off large groups of Indians. More than once he took shelter on the rock in order to escape the pursuit of the Indians. It consisted of a fragment of a mountain that was separated from the independent and neighboring mountains, forming kind of a half cone. It was surrounded with a yawning chasm. Its eastern base, washed by the Capone River, rises to the height of 450 feet. While the western side is a solid mass of granite, which stands directly perpendicular. The base of the rock would probably not exceed 1,000 yards around. From its western side, it can be accessed by a man on foot to within almost the very summit. The rock suddenly shoots up about 90 to 100 feet and is 8 or 10 feet in thickness. It runs kind of a north-south direction. On the eastern face of the rock, from where the top of the rock is approached, a very narrow, winding path is formed. The path is too narrow for more than one person to ascend at a time. It would be easy for one person to defend the top of the rock from dozens of pursuers. Sometime around 1780, Cotty was chased to the top of this rock by a bunch of locals. Once he was at a flat spot where a tree was growing, Cotty positioned himself in such a way he could keep the attackers from getting to him. Due to the steep trail, he was able to defend himself even after he had run out of ammunition. It didn't take long for the Indians to decide this was a losing situation, and they left. Later that evening, Cotty was able to descend unhindered. Well, later on, once more, Cotty found himself being chased by the locals, and so he went back up the rock. The legend grew over time, and the rock became known as Cotty's Castle, since he did kind of use it as such. Now, the Castle Rock is in no way an actual castle. It's just a nickname. In Loveland, Ohio, they do have an actual castle. Not an old one like you'll find in England or Romania, but still it's a castle. Chateau La Roche, also known as the Loveland Castle, is a museum on the banks of the Little Miami River north of Loveland, Ohio. The castle was a recreation of historical European castles constructed in the 1920s by a Boy Scout troop leader and a World War I veteran. Harry D. Andrews was very interested in medieval construction, and he loved the time when knights would ride out of castles and pound the tar out of each other. The lack of toilet paper and deodorant was not a detractor to him. When Harry came back from the war, he built the castle on promotional plots of land that were obtained by paying for 1-year subscriptions to the Cincinnati Enquirer. Buy a newspaper and get some land. Andrews named the castle after the military hospital in Chateau La Roche in southwest France, where he was stationed during World War I. The name means rock castle in French. For over 50 years, Andrews worked on his castle project. He pulled stones from the nearby Little Miami River, and when its supply was exhausted, he began making bricks out of cement using quart milk cartons. When Andrews died in 1981, he left the castle to a Boy Scout troop known as the Knights of the Golden Trail, or KGOT. The castle has been extensively upgraded and renovated in the years since Andrews' death, and has been mostly completed by the Knights. The East Tower now houses a short video presentation on Andrews' quest to finish his dream. The walls of the upstairs chapel feature many stones brought back by Andrews in his world travels, and others sent to him from foreign locations by his friends and followers. Recently completed are an expansive and outside garden and greenhouse. Tales of the castle being haunted often come from the Chateau La Roche's own volunteer knights. They've been many over the years. Just who was this guy that built the castle and left it to a bunch of Boy Scouts? Born in 1890, Andrews graduated from Colgate College. He had a 189-point IQ, and he was able to learn 7 languages before joining the Army in 1917, and then being sent to Fort Dix in New Jersey. His unit was being readied to take their place in the trenches of France or Belgium when meningitis swept through the camp, killing 7,000 of the soldiers, including Andrews. Well, that was a short story. What about going to France and building the castle? Andrews' body lay on a slab in the morgue for 2 days before they got around to performing an autopsy. The doctor noticed that Andrews bled any time he made an incision. They were trying to collect bacterial samples to see what had killed him, to make sure that he had died from meningitis and not some other disease which was running rampant at the time. Well, the doctors, being in the Army, decided, let's inject him with some adrenaline and see what happens. Andrews began to breathe, which kind of surprised the doctors. He slowly recovered. It didn't take long to realize that Andrews was blind and paralyzed. The doctors gave Andrews maybe 2 days to live. Harry Andrews had returned from the dead, but he wasn't expected to last very long. Harry Andrews defied the laws of medicine and made a full recovery. Seeing a use for this wonder patient, the army doctors began using his blood as a form of quick treatment for other soldiers who were suffering from meningitis. If you've never been in the military, they own you up until you either die or get discharged. I guess Harry dying didn't quite count as a reason to get rid of him. Harry was happy to be alive and willingly allowed his blood to be used as a treatment. Once he was recovered enough, Harry trained as a field medic. He was eventually shipped to France and assigned to the aid station at Chateau La Roche, France. During his time in France, Harry was dubbed with a knighthood after saving the life of an English nobleman's son. He became Sir Harry, even though royal titles are not used in the U.S. Having an IQ of 189, Harry studied architecture at Toulouse, and he taught other American soldiers to speak the native tongues. Harry Andrews had been engaged to marry his sweetheart, but when he'd been declared dead, she found a new man and married him. Harry was devastated, and he swore he would never marry again. To distract himself, he put all of his time and energy into studying medieval knights and the world they lived in. Upon his return to the States, Sir Harry found a Boy Scout troop that he dubbed the Knights of the Golden Trail. The young men in this troop are bound by an oath to restore nobility and civility to modern society, just as the knights of old did for medieval Europe. Their only governing rules were the 10 Commandments. Actually, knights of old weren't all that well behaved. Most were just thugs in armor who rode around doing as they pleased. Most of the chivalry stuff came around in the Renaissance, when writers came up with stories about how great things were before people started to think again. Around 1927, Sir Harry decided that his troop of knights deserved a proper castle, and so he used land that had been donated from a newspaper subscription contest and began working on Chateau La Roche here in the U.S. Sir Harry started quarrying stones from the Little Miami in 1929, but construction of his castle didn't really get into full gear until he retired in 1955. From the age of 65 to 91, Sir Harry would haul 65 pounds of stones from the river each and every day, continually adding to his masterpiece. Andrews accidentally caught himself on fire one day while burning some trash at the castle in 1981. He died from the injuries he sustained. This time, he stayed dead. Mostly. Before his death, Sir Harry used to tell his scouts about the ghost of a Norman knight that would come to his door late at night while he was living in his new castle. The knight is thought to be attached to one of the medieval artifacts that have been brought from Europe to decorate the castle, and he's still seen on occasions today. Another presence Harry called Casper Poltergeist is still around, moving objects and banging on doors and even shocking people. Some folks have reported receiving an electric jolt from some unseen entity, which is supposed to be a punishment for some offense they committed. Knights of the castle say that this spirit has alerted them when any mischievous scouts have tried to take things from the castle. He's also foiled a few burglary attempts and even drew attention to a septic tank problem by repeatedly slamming the bathroom door until they went to see what all the noise was about. Anytime anything is left sitting on Sir Harry's bed, it will be on the floor the next day. The knights take great care to place an item in the middle of the bed, and then they lock the door. The key is kept safe all night, and then in the morning the knights will go to check the bed. The item will be sitting on the floor every time. There's an old typewriter that will mysteriously have messages written out in the morning as well. The knights believe that this is Harry sending them messages. Harry was also known for telling about the ghosts of 2 children that died in a fire on the land before he came into possession of the property. Young folks staying at overnight slumber parties would attempt to communicate with these spirits that one psychic described as being a 13-year-old boy and his 7-year-old sister. 2 people have been seen, try this again. Today, people have seen the ghost of a young woman who died in a moonshill. What the heck is a moonshill? Today, people have seen the ghost of a young woman who died in a moonshine still explosion inside a cave just down the river from the castle. The story goes that during the earliest days of construction on his castle, Sir Harry had heard a loud explosion come from the cave. He went to investigate and discovered the still. In the smoldering remains was the body of a young woman who had been crushed under a barrel. Since then, a woman with long hair and a billowing gown has been seen walking along the river and through the castle's garden. Not all the sightings are of ghosts. There was a thing seen by people who described it as being a kind of an egg shape with glowing red eyes. The thing was seen sitting in a willow tree for years. When the tree eventually died in 1970, the thing has not been seen since. Visitors to the castle on occasion will hear growling sounds deep inside the dungeon, which is actually just the basement where Harry used to store his canned goods. The growling cannot be attributed to anything found in the basement or anywhere nearby. It's not a pump, it's not a machine, it's not some gadget sitting in a corner somewhere. It's not coming from outside, it's in the basement. Once in a while, somebody will find scratches on their skin on places that are unexplained by anything down in the basement. This sounds as if some kind of an elemental has snuck into the castle, something that never walked the earth while alive. Chandeliers have been seen to suddenly start swinging back and forth. People have seen shadows that move around with nothing to cast them. They hear footsteps coming from empty hallways, and sometimes they'll hear a disembodied voice. There's a rocking chair that moves on its own, which is attributed to Sir Harry, or maybe it's one of his friends in the other world. If you'd like to visit the castle, you can go to their website and look for the hours of operation. Being the 2020s, you want to call ahead and make sure they'll be open and able to go inside. You can go to the website at www.lovelandcastle.org. You can also look at pictures of the castle by simply searching Loveland Castle on the internet. It's quite a structure and you ought to really check it out. And now for a couple of commercials for my friends so they don't feel as if I've forgotten them. If you hear a bump in the night and you think you might have unwanted guests, contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society. They do more than just ghost hunts. They're into UFOs, cryptids, anything unusual. You can reach them at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. If you have to hold things out at arm's length so you can focus on them, maybe it's time you got your eyes checked. Swing on by Optica del Norte at 107 Calle del Norte, right across from the Embassy Suite. You should be able to focus on what's about to grab you. How about taking better care of your skin? If you're buying all your cosmetics at the grocery store because it's cheaper, well, you've heard the saying, you get what you pay for. Try contacting Lourdes James at 956-723-3019 and see about getting a free skincare consultation. Coffee is what makes the world go round. And here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike, the best coffee on the planet. It's time you started enjoying life a little more than you have been. If you'd like to buy their coffee and you're not in the Laredo area, you can order it online at organicmancoffeetrike.shop. And now back to the show. On one of our many trips around the country, my wife and I found a castle in the hills of Oklahoma, which is a weird place to find a castle. Turner Falls is a waterfall on Honey Creek in Arbuckle Mountains of south central Oklahoma, about 6 miles south of Davis. The waterfall is 77 feet high. We had stopped at a state visitor center on I-35 during the trip. On the wall of the center was a huge photo of the falls. We asked the lady behind the counter about this impressive image, and she told us that Turner Falls was like a landmark in the area, and then she told us how we could get there. The funny thing about the image is the falls are not in a state park. It's a city park. Mazeppa Thomas Turner, a Scottish immigrant farmer who married Laura Johnson, who was a Chickasaw woman, settled in the area in 1878, and he discovered the falls, and that's where they got their name, Turner Falls. It had been a recreational use beginning in 1868. At the time, Turner Falls was located in Pickens County, Chickasaw Nation. Today, the falls are part of Turner Falls Park, a city park operated by the city of Davis, Oklahoma. The falls cascade into a natural swimming pool, one of 2 such pools within the park, and there are popular tourist destinations in the summer. The city of Davis acquired the park in 1919, and they operated it until 1950. It then was leased to the local facility until 1978, when it was resumed control by the city. There are people living inside the park. They own houses and some land. Some of these people rent out their places to make a few extra bucks during the summertime. The park is 1,500 acres, and it contains nature trails, caves, other interesting geological features, and a castle. The castle came into existence in 1930. Ellsworth Collings was the Dean of Education at the Department of the University of Oklahoma, and he was also a very famous author at the time. The total area covered by the castle is a little less than an acre. It consists of a house that has 2 living rooms and 3 bedrooms. The house was well decorated with ornaments and rocks of various types, such as rust-colored rose rocks. Also, there are 2 outbuildings called outhouses outside the main building. One looks like it was a jail. Further up the hill is a garage in the compound, which is accessed from a road that runs along the ridgeline. It's a steep climb up to the stairs to the castle, but it's kind of neat, and it's something you really ought to see if you're passing by. You can find images of the castle by searching Turner Falls Castle. It's interesting to see what people did with their spare time. And now, back to Loveland once more. Loveland, Ohio can best be described as a sleepy pocket suburb in the hills north of Cincinnati. Nestled along the Little Miami River, Loveland is a community that straddles 3 counties and is home to a true enigma of aquatic realm. Loveland, Ohio is the home to the legendary Loveland Frogmen. The legend of the Loveland Frogmen begins in the early summer of 1955. A salesman or businessman was traveling along one of the many small roads in Ohio. As he was drawing near one of the bridges near Loveland, he stopped along the Little Miami to stretch his legs and maybe respond to the call of nature. It was the middle of nowhere, and there's nobody around, so it's a good place to do what you have to do. As he stood there on the side of the road, he spotted 3 creatures moving around in the brush by the edge of the river. He said they were about 3 to 4 feet tall and covered with leathery skin. The creatures were described as standing erect, bipedal, and having the head and face that looked like frogs. He also said they had webbed hands and feet, and deep wrinkles on their faces. They appeared to be totally hairless. As he stood there in shock, wondering what he was seeing, one of the creatures hefted what looked like a long, thin metal cylinder over its head. The cylinder began emitting sparks and a pulsating light. Thinking things must be getting interesting, the businessman ran to his car and jumped in. He hit the gas and sped away, thinking he was about to be attacked. Driving into town, the businessman stopped at the police station to ask about what he had just seen, and then he filed a report. Back then, people were still more concerned with others' safety than with public ridicule, like what happened in Point Pleasant back in 1966. Had this been the one and only sighting, it could be considered to either be misidentification or a hoax. March 3rd, 1972, at 1 a.m., police officer Ray Shockey was traveling on Riverside Drive heading into Loveland. The weather was being nasty, so the police officer was traveling cautiously. The roads were becoming slick with ice. As he came to a bridge over the Little Miami, the officer spotted a weird-looking creature that was scuttling across the road right in front of his patrol car. Slamming on the brakes, Shockey came to a stop, with the creature still illuminated by his headlights. What he saw looked like a giant frog, maybe 3 or 4 feet tall. It looked like it weighed 50 to 75 pounds. That's a lot of frog. The frog creature stood up. It was now on just its back legs. It stared at him over the hood of the car. The officer said the creature had leathery green skin. It had no hair, and it moved like a man walking on 2 legs. The creature slithered over the top of the guardrail to the bridge and dropped into the water below. Where the creature had moved over the guardrail, there were rub marks as if something abrasive had been drug over it. The second sighting occurred 2 weeks later, while police officer Mark Matthews had an encounter of his own. According to the report, Officer Matthews, while driving into Loveland, spotted what he believed to be an injured animal laying on the pavement. Matthews climbed out of his cruiser with the intention of removing the carcass from the already ice-slicked road, when the creature abruptly lurched upwards into a crouching position. Taken aback by the frogman's reptilian visage, Matthews unholstered his revolver and took a shot at it, which the creature then proceeded to hobble over to the side of the road, step over the guardrail, meanwhile keeping an eye on the cop. As the frogman was walking away, the officer saw what looked like a tail. Not very long, but definitely a tail. Matthews' frogman matched the first officer's description down to the last detail, with the exception of the tail, which was absent in the earlier report. Could this just be a misidentification, or maybe just something they decided to make up? Like police make things up all the time, especially when they're making a report in the middle of the night. Oh, by the way, Sarge, I think I'm going crazy. This does not lend a good reputation to anyone, especially back in the 50s. The local Indian population, the Shawnee and the Twitwi tribes, were familiar with a creature or a species of creatures they called the Shawnahawk, or the river demon. This creature had been told of in tales dating back for dozens of generations. The creature is described as being a large reptile that could walk on two legs. The creature lived mostly along the banks of the Little Miami River. It is said that this creature threatened the indigenous tribes until they sent their greatest warriors to confront the demons. After the fray was decided, the Shawnahawk is said to have gone into hiding. When the Native Americans were driven from the territory by the encroaching settlers, the Shawnahawk is said to have returned to the riverbanks. The Shawnahawk subsides on a diet of mostly fish and plants. And nothing wrong with that. However, they also like meat. This typically comes in the form of a stolen calf or a goat from the local farms. Animals go missing on a regular basis from farms along the river. The Shawnahawk have a bit of a preference in their diet. They have a fondness for human flesh. This is the fondness that caused the Twitwi Indians to hunt down the Shawnahawk in the 1700s in order to stop the locals from disappearing. Because the Indians have moved out of the area and nobody in the area believes in the frogmen or the Shawnahawk, the Miami River may be populated by these creatures again today. It is said that the entrances to their caves are mostly found under the hidden tributaries of the rivers, although a few are located deep in the surrounding woods. Some think that one of the entrances may even go into the Loveland sewers. There are so many underground pipes running in so many unused areas of the town that nobody knows for certain where all these pipes might be. Maybe these frogmen are using them to access the town. There's no evidence of any of these creatures actually being in the sewers, but then who's really down there looking? Despite being small, the Shawnahawk are strong. They can be vicious when attacking their prey. Their hind legs are powerful when kicking, and they have razor-sharp claws what they use to tear into their victims. According to the Indians, a few of these creatures are shaman as well, and they're able to cast spells. The Shawnahawk currently stay hidden in their caves, only surfacing to worship their gods under the full moon, explore, or steal food. Recently, they have begun to be a little more daring in their trips to the surface. A few of the creatures have a growing desire to feast once more on human flesh, which has thus far been satisfied by an occasional drifter. With all the people that disappear each year, I wonder how many of them are being consumed. So many people every year disappear, and yet nobody knows where they go. They never find any remains. Maybe someday somebody's going to stumble across the remnants. August 3rd, 2016. Sam Jacobs and his girlfriend were walking along the Madera Road near Lake Isabella in Loveland, Ohio. As they were walking, they saw what just might be the Loveland Frogmen. Sam was doing what just about every teenager in those days was doing. He was playing Pokemon Go. I've heard several instances where people playing this game have stumbled across something dangerous. He captured a quick video as well as some photographs of this encounter before leaving the area in a large hurry. His story videos and photos were in the media the following afternoon. Jacobs was quoted by a few local television stations. "We saw a huge frog near the water." Not in the game. This was an actual giant frog. Jacobs and his girlfriend had gone back to her home immediately after their sighting, and his girlfriend's parents had told them about the legend of the Loveland Frogmen. I looked at the images of what he had caught with his camera. It looks like a giant frog standing on two legs. Could this be CGI, or are the frogmen still out there looking for their next meal? Saying all the pirates buried their treasure on uninhabited islands is kind of like saying everybody living in Texas rides a horse. Some of us don't own horses. They're expensive, and you have to take care of them. You have to find some place to keep them, and they poop a lot. No, thank you. My truck, a lot easier to take care of. A pirate's treasure is the stuff of many adventure stories, and finding it has made a few people enormously rich over the years. What most folks don't know about pirates and their treasure, try that again, what most people do think they know about pirates and their treasure comes from one book, Treasure Island. Well, few pirates actually followed the mold put forth in the book. Most stole enough gold to stay alive for a short period of time before dying from some nasty disease or being killed by the authorities. They carried their meager fortunes around with them, spending it in bars and other establishments. One or two were smart enough to never get caught. Some did bury their treasure in places so they could come back later on and dig it up. Not all returned. Jean Lafitte's treasure is out there somewhere. Captain Kidd had a huge pile of gold that is still missing. Then there was Fat Nicholas of Hispaniola. Who? Not very many people know of this pirate. He never got his name in a book or a movie. Maybe it was his name that just put people off. Well, Hispaniola became the Dominican Republic in the east and Haiti in the west later on. If you were a clever pirate, you'd want people to not know who you were. If nobody knows your name, they don't know who to look for or where to find you. Nicholas D La Petromaine was born sometime in the 1920s. He was the illegitimate son of a Louisiana farmer's not-too-proper daughter and a sailor she met in New Orleans. After it became obvious that the daughter was about to give birth, she was told, find someplace else to live. They used to do this back then. Unwed mothers were sent away to give birth. Give the kid up for adoption, and then meekly come back home and beg for forgiveness. Some chose to find their own ways in life. Some turned to a less guarded style of life, while few went on to become wealthy. Nick's mom went to work in a bar. She sang, danced, and became quite well known on the riverboat circuit. This tells me if she wasn't rich, she was well known for things she did. Her reputation was a bit loose. Young Nicholas was fascinated by tales of the father he'd never known, who had swept his mother off her feet. He dreamed of a life on the high seas. Pirates were kind of like superheroes to some folks. Growing up living along the riverfront, Nick learned a lot of things that helped him in his coming adulthood. He also learned to speak French and Spanish fluently. He was so fluent that people were fooled by where he was from. He could convince people he was from any country in the world that spoke French or Spanish. Wanting a life of adventure as a pirate, Nicholas began robbing boats along the river. He became very proficient at attacking riverboats and stealing anything of value. Folks began calling him Nasty Nick. All the riverboats on the Mississippi knew his name. Captains would take precautions to keep Nasty Nick from stealing their cargo or robbing their passengers. After several years robbing riverboats, a bounty was placed on his head, so big that Nasty Nick knew it was no longer safe to stay along the Mississippi. Not only were the authorities looking for him, but anybody wanting to make a small fortune with very little work could simply tell the law where to find a Nasty Nick. Even his friends were no longer to be trusted. The official story was that he simply disappeared. People slowly realized that Nasty Nick was no longer attacking riverboats. A lot of them began to believe he had died from either a gunshot wound or maybe somebody had stabbed him in a dark alley. Nobody ever came along to collect the reward. A young man turned up in Port-au-Prince one day. He had come in on board a sailing ship out of New Orleans. He soon found a pirate in need of a crew to sail about the Caribbean and steal from the merchants in the area. It wasn't all that hard to find a pirate. You just hung out at the waterfront bars and listened. Soon, this young man named Nicholas was working in his dream job. He was a full-blown pirate on the high seas. It wasn't long before he was the captain of his own ship, growing wealthy and very well fed. This led to the moniker Fat Nicholas. To become a captain of a pirate ship, one way was by vote. The crew would elect whoever they thought was smart enough to make them all rich. Nicholas knew a lot of things about most of the crew didn't understand. Plus, he was fluent in all those languages. Nicholas was a very successful pirate and a well-fed pirate. He soon became known as Fat Nicholas of Hispaniola. His ability to speak French and Spanish as well as English allowed him to claim his place of birth was in the Caribbean. The less folks know about you, the harder it is to get caught. The Fat Nicholas was smart enough to hang on to most of his stolen goods. He secreted his stash away and watched as it grew into a large fortune. Nicholas was into writing. An odd thing for most pirates. He was well educated. He wrote a poem about traveling to the Garden of Eden and planting a precious seed. It describes sailing the Euphrates and the Hebrew name, Hiddekel rivers. It also mentions, seemingly in passing, the confluence of the Pison and the Gihon. If you're familiar with the book of Genesis, you may recognize these rivers. The poem also mentions a city on 7 hills. As the authorities began to raise the price on his head, Fat Nicholas knew the time was growing short. People around him were no longer to be trusted. Anybody needing a quick handful of cash simply had to tell the law where he was. Yes, history was repeating itself. So once more, Nicholas did a vanishing act. Once more, folks thought he had been killed in action while attacking the wrong ship, or somebody had killed him but failed to collect the reward. The Fat Nicholas and Nasty Nick decided it was time to retire. Where would a pirate feel safe from those who were still interested in collecting the reward that was still hanging over his head? Someplace nobody would think to look. Having acquired a massive fortune in gold and silver, Nicholas moved back to the Mississippi. Some think he changed his name and lived out the rest of his life in New Orleans. Some looked at that poem and thought, what did he mean by all that fancy talk? Some people say he sailed up the Mississippi as far as he felt uneasy. Once he found a safe place to get off the riverboat, he settled down and lived out his life. The treasure was buried someplace where only he could find it. Nicholas D La Petromaine could have changed his name once more, or for that matter, he could have gone back to the original name, since people only knew him as Nasty Nick or Fat Nicholas of Hispaniola. The Euphrates might have been a metaphor for the Mississippi. This seems plain to some. The Hiddekel could represent the Ohio River that cuts off from the east from the Mississippi. His mention of the confluence of the Pison and the Gihon makes this a possibility, as the Ohio is formed by the confluence of the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers. This might lead one to conclude that the treasure is buried somewhere in or around Cincinnati, Ohio. The precious seed he planted in the Garden of Eden could refer to Eden Park. Eden Park is right on the Ohio River in Cincinnati. Would it be a good idea to bury his vast treasure in an area inhabited by hundreds of people? In the 1850s or 60s, Cincinnati was already a large city. The Ohio River connected with the Mississippi near Wycliffe, Indiana. Having nothing but time and money, Nicholas could have enjoyed the trip, sitting in one of the better staterooms on the riverboat, looking for the right place to go ashore. With nearly 300,000 people, Cincinnati was Ohio's biggest city back then, and it had the country's densest population, with about 37,000 people per square mile. The city had an art academy, art museum, music hall, opera house, exposition building, and a public library. Remember, Nicholas was a man of learning. He was a writer, and he loved to read. There were about 130 magazines and newspapers produced in the city. There were more than 200 churches, 5 hospitals, and you could get a college education through the University of Cincinnati. Being a rich man, maybe Nasty Nick, Fat Nicholas of Hispaniola, and Nicholas La Petromaine thought this was the place to live. But was it the place to hide his wealth? Digging a deep hole in the middle of town and burying a pile of gold and silver is not the way to keep what you stole. The Little Miami is just a short boat ride east from Cincinnati. Nicholas could have rowed a boat a short ways up the Little Miami and found an isolated spot to plant his treasure. He could have spent a day or two looking for the right place. The banks of the Little Miami are honeycombed with small caves he could have used as his hiding spot. If one or two of you out there listening get inspired to go looking for Fat Nicholas's treasure, and you find it, don't forget where you got the idea. Send me a small reward, maybe a pound of gold or two. That would be nice. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell your friends. Let them know what they're missing. If you have any ideas for a show, something you'd like to hear about, let me know. You can contact me at strangethings@arkanasa.com. Till next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, the same murder 3? Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.